This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
Today on CityCast Philly, 10 years ago, on the night of November 2nd, 2014, Carlesha Gaither Freeland was abducted off a street in Germantown at knifepoint, shoved into a car, and held against her will for 3 days. It was all caught on camera. I'm speaking with Claudia Vargas, an investigative reporter at NBC 10. Her new true crime documentary details this gripping Philadelphia story. It's Monday, January 6th. I'm Trenae Nuri, and here's what Philly's talking about. Claudia, before we get into some of the details of this case, how did you come across Carlesha's story?
I've been in Philly now as a journalist for 15 years, and I was here when that all happened. Now, I wasn't covering it, but I just remember it so vividly, and I think everybody was following that story. So early last year, we found out that Lifetime had done a movie on Carlesha, and it had been such a big profile case that we decided to do our own story in the fact that there was a movie about Carlesha Gaither Freeland's kidnapping. So we called her and asked if she'd be willing to talk about what it was like to have this movie out on her, and she was willing to talk. And we honestly just really connected. I thought she had such an interesting story. She was just so brave in telling of what had happened that from there, I came back and I spoke with one of our producers and I said, hey, I think it'd be so interesting for us to do our own thing on Carlesha. Would you be up for it? And so it's as long as Carlesha's okay with it and she's willing to talk more, then sure, let's do it. So I checked in with her and I said, how would you feel if we did a documentary on it? And so that's kind of how we got started on it.
So spoiler alert, she was found. But let's break this all down. Let's start at the beginning of the documentary. We're in Germantown on November 2nd, 2014, around 9 p.m. And that's when we meet Dwayne Fletcher. Who is he?
So he was just a guy who's living on that block. He was going to a corner store just to get something to eat. And he notices a woman who is walking in front of him. She seems nervous, is looking back. And so he thinks, it's dark, she's probably nervous that I'm some guy walking behind her. Let me cross the street and move away from her just to give her some peace. So he walks across the street, then makes a left at the end of the street, kind of doesn't think anything more of it. And as he's halfway down the block, he hears a shriek, a scream, turns around, and sees the woman who he had just passed be, as he says, tussling with another man. And he right away calls 911, says, I think I'm witnessing a kidnapping. And from there, he thought he heard gunshots. So he takes cover. And when he pops up, thinking that, he's finally safe now, he sees that the car's gone. She was shoved into a car and drives away. So he called 911 again, and cops came out and, started their investigation.
Here's a clip of Dwayne recounting what he saw that night.
So I'm walking down the street. I get almost to the middle of the block. Once I get almost down to the middle of the block, I hear a scream. That scream was just a piercing. It was a piercing. Once I looked at the corner, I seen 2 images. They was dressed in black, but one of the bigger images was tussling. They was tussling and tussling. And somebody in black clothes, dragging her away.
When Dwayne initially saw Carlesha, what was she doing, or where was she going? Where was she coming from?
Yeah. Well, obviously, he had no idea who she was, but she, now from what we've learned, she was actually coming back from visiting her godchild. They were just getting together that night with family. She took the bus that she normally takes and then was walking home. Same route she takes whenever she's coming home from work. So nothing
unusual,
out of the ordinary,
right? Yeah.
Right. And this man went up to her, asked her for directions. She stopped, and that was it.
Who was that man?
So it took a while for police to figure out who that man was, because while they caught it on surveillance, they didn't know who took her. And that was part of the whole investigation. And, they were asking for the public's help. Do you recognize this person? Because to fast forward, so once she gets kidnapped and Dwayne calls 911, police show up on scene. But at first they didn't think that she had been kidnapped because they said there's no black on black kidnapping. That doesn't make sense. It was probably a domestic situation. Are you sure she was kidnapped? And because Dwayne had said he heard gunshots, they didn't find any gun shells. So they said, well, there wasn't really a shooting. Are you sure you're telling us the truth? And so they really questioned Dwayne. at first. And then it was when the police officer noticed that there were surveillance cameras on that building. He called the people who own the building to pull that surveillance video. And it was then that they saw the surveillance that captured the entire kidnapping. And they knew then that it was a kidnapping. So that led them to obviously start their investigation. FBI came out. It was tons of law enforcement to try to find out, where she was and who the man was. And it wasn't until, I believe it was the second day, that throughout their investigation, then people were just showing the surveillance video everywhere. And then the next day, they had captured another surveillance picture of him using her debit card at a bank. And so that gave more of a close-up image of his face. So they blasted that all over the news. People were seeing it across country. And there was a law enforcement agency in Virginia that noticed his picture and said, that looks like a guy we're looking for. And when they looked into it, they determined it was Delvin Barnes. And so that's how they got the name. And this is a man who had just been accused of some pretty heinous crime. He had raped, beaten, and left for dead, basically, a 16-year-old girl. He had made her dig her own grave. And then a few days later, he drove up to Philly, and now you know what happened.
So this story crossed state lines.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Claudia, one of the pieces that stood out to me in this documentary is that Carlesha leaves some clues that ultimately helped detectives, and a photojournalist from your station was involved in finding some of this evidence.
Yeah, it was really crucial to police, the fact that Carlesha, from the very beginning, made a clear choice to try to leave clues behind. Something that, when I interviewed her, I said, I don't think I would have done that. She decided in a split second to drop her cell phone and her glasses. And her decision on that was because she said, I've seen scary movies. I know the bad guy always tosses a cell phone. I wasn't going to probably be able to use my phone to call for help. So if I leave it behind, maybe somebody will find it and be able to realize that I'm actually missing. She was very self-aware of the fact that grown adults, it takes a lot for law enforcement to consider them being kidnapped. Usually people normally think that they decided to disappear on their own.
When we come back, we'll learn how law enforcement agencies work together across state lines to find Carlesha. That's after the break.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Just before the break, we talked about how initially some of the law enforcement agents that were a part of this case weren't really sure about how all of this was really happening. But there was also a sense of urgency that needed to happen, and especially with cases like this when people are kidnapped, right?
Yeah, absolutely. They had hundreds of officers out there. It was federal, state, local authorities trying to find her, digging up, anything they could, every little clue. So once they got the surveillance video from the PNC, it was trying to connect it to what else could they find. Then one of the key moments was when there was a farmer in Maryland found some random trash on the grass on her farm, and initially didn't think anything of it, but then decided to look at it, and it was a receipt from Philadelphia. And she had been seeing the coverage of this missing girl from Philadelphia on TV.
Wow.
So she was like, I wonder if this could be connected. She's like, maybe it's nothing, but she called the FBI. FBI came out, looked at it, and that receipt, they went to the store from Philadelphia where it was from. It was a grocery store. And they pulled the surveillance video, and sure enough, it was the same guy that they had seen on surveillance at the bank. So they immediately knew it was the same person. They had been at that location. And then, that was just yet another clue to help them along the way.
Was there anything else that helped law enforcement find Carlesha?
There was a key moment when the car that Delvin Barnes had, police found out that it had a GPS locator. And that was because when he went to purchase his car, he didn't have good credit, and the car dealership wanted to be able to repossess the car if they needed to. So that was a key moment when police found out, oh my gosh, we can track this car. So I won't give away what happens when they try to track the car. But that was a big moment. And that was, as Carlesha likes to say, was somebody looking out for her and making sure that the things played out how they did.
Like a higher being.
Yes.
So law enforcement was really coordinated in this case. Can you tell me about how they actually worked together throughout the case?
Yeah, so initially it was, Philly police responded. Then once they knew it was a kidnapping, they called the FBI. And it was really a very coordinated effort. So they all headquartered up in Philly PD, which at the time was at 8th and Race, the old headquarters there. And they were coordinating with people on the ground in Maryland and Virginia because, as we said, this was just, it crossed state lines. And, it took 3 days to find her, but eventually it was the work of all these law enforcement agencies working together, including then at the end it was the ATF who ultimately found her. And it was, it was pretty incredible just how they all worked together.
Would you say that this was a happy ending?
I mean, she was found. So for that, I think everybody's grateful for. But obviously she went through a lot in those 3 days. And, she was very brave to talk about that. And so we hear about that more in the documentary. But it was obviously a very traumatic 3 days for her.
Barnes confesses to abducting her and sexually assaulting her.
Mm-hmm.
He called your team twice on the phone from prison.
Mm-hmm.
What happened in those conversations?
We had initially asked if he would be willing to participate in the documentary. And so we were really trying to arrange, prison interview with him. That unfortunately got denied through the prison system. But he did call us twice. And he basically tried to explain himself. He said that, he had a really traumatic childhood, that, as he said, we kind of quote some of the conversation in the documentary. He said a normal person doesn't go from normal to abnormal or something to that effect. But he basically said he blamed his childhood and the fact that his father beat his mom. And he essentially was making all these excuses for why he did this. But we have a response from the prosecutor to his defense.
I want to play a clip from the documentary. And this really stood out to me because Barnes says something nice about Carlesha.
On the phone, Barnes said Carlesha is a good person. That sentiment may be why she lived.
She befriended him as a way of knowing that if they got closer than just, abductee and kidnapper, that she would have a chance of surviving.
Carlesha befriended Barnes during all of this?
Yeah, it was pretty incredible. She decided to try to talk to him and see where his mind was at. She thought that that could help her maybe get him to return her or just stop doing what he was doing. So she, retells some of those conversations, and it was about his daughter, how he missed her. He at one point listens to a voicemail from his daughter. And so Carlesha really used her skills as a nurse and talking to people who are going through stuff to try to get him just to talk a little bit more about what was going on and what his motivation and kind of why he was doing what he was doing. So, and, as you heard the prosecutor say, it ultimately probably saved her.
In the documentary, you talk with Carlesha about healing. What does healing look like for her?
She's still working through that. She said 10 years later, she's still going to therapy, trying to work through everything that happened to her. But when you talk to her, you just see how resilient she is and just what an incredible person she is. And now that, as she says, she has a son now, she wants to just enjoy life and, provide a good life for her and her son.
Whatever happened to Dwayne Fletcher? That was the man who we learned about at the beginning of this investigation.
Yeah, he's still around. He started a boxing club and has a nonprofit. And he says a lot of that was a result of going through what he went through with Carlesha and being able to help. He was someone who had been in and out of prison for much of his life. And when this whole incident happened, he realized that he could do some good. And as he says in the documentary, he just never really knew how to put his goodness to use. And this was one instance in which he could. And it really turned his life around.
He's one of the heroes in this story, and law enforcement seems to have also participated as heroes in this story. What did you learn about this from your experience? And you've covered investigations before.
I think it was really interesting just how it was both civilians and law enforcement officials who came together for a better good and really worked together to save her, because Dwayne, as he says, he didn't have to call police. Most people would have just picked up the cell phone that she dropped and, ran off with it. He stopped, called police, stayed there, and gave police all the information that they needed. And if it wasn't for him, they would have probably never even thought to look at that surveillance video because they would have never known that she was actually kidnapped.
Or he could have just ignored the whole thing.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Same with the farmer, too.
Yeah.
You spoke to so many people, from local Philly detectives to prosecutors to the FBI to the ATF, like you mentioned. Was it difficult to get people to talk to you? And it seems like in the documentary, we see them getting emotional about this case.
I feel like there's always a little convincing that needs to be done and explaining, why we're doing it and why we want to talk to them. But ultimately, everybody was pretty agreeable to discussing their role in the investigation. And yeah, this was something that really touched people, that stayed with them. As you said, there were some folks in the documentary who got emotional just talking about it even 10 years later. So it's a case that really stuck with people for a long time.
Sometimes when I'm scrolling on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, I see people posting about missing children, missing people. Is that a big problem in Philadelphia?
So we actually looked at that we did a little sidebar story. So it wasn't part of the documentary, but kind of my question with doing all of this was Carlesha got such a huge response from law enforcement that we don't really see when people are just reported missing. So part of it is, of course, that there was the surveillance video. Like, there were a lot of things that fell into place with Carlesha for it to have gotten the response that it did and for her to have been found. Others aren't so lucky. Like, there isn't surveillance video of every person who goes missing.
Right.
And so that was really key in her case. As for other people who go missing, it's tough to say what happened. I spoke to one of the officers who works in some of these cases, and people could have been kidnapped. We just don't know until we get that evidence, until we get a witness. And so that's really, when you look back at Carlesha, she had a witness, she had surveillance, she left clues behind. So it was all these things that just fit perfectly into this case that allowed law enforcement to find her.
Claudia, you lay out the story in the documentary in such an intriguing way, and just step-by-step accounts of how Carlesha was found. It's really an extraordinary story.
This documentary really wouldn't have been possible without Carlesha. It was really thanks to her resilience, her strength in telling the story. It was a hard story for her to tell. As I said, she's still going through a lot of that recovery process. And so we're just grateful for her for being open to telling her story multiple times, because we visited her several times to talk through everything that happened.
Claudia Vargas, investigative reporter at NBC Philadelphia, Channel 10. Thank you so much for sharing the story.
Thanks so much for having me.
You can stream the full documentary, Finding Carlesha, now on Peacock, or click the YouTube link in the show notes. That's all for today here on CityCast Philly. Let us know what you think of this episode and tell a friend. Rate the show, leave us a review, and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to sign up for our morning newsletter, Hey Philly, to learn more about what else Philly's talking about. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.